England is burning. Along the cold, grey coastline, dark shapes emerge from the sea. Long ships cutting through the waves with practiced ease. Their sails are filled not only with wind, but with intent. These are not wandering raiders. They are hunters who know their prey is rich, divided, and afraid. Church bells ring in warning. Villages scatter. Monasteries that once stood as symbols of faith and learning now tremble as targets of silver and blood. At the center of this collapsing world sits a king, crowned, anointed, and yet powerless. His name is Æthelred, later remembered by history as the Unready, not because he was foolish, but because he was ill-advised, hesitant, and trapped by his own court. While enemies strike with speed and certainty, his decisions arrive late, divided, or disastrously wrong. This is not a story of a single lost battle, but of a slow unraveling, a kingdom weakened from within, a ruler who pays his enemies instead of breaking them, and a series of choices that turn England into the richest prize in the Viking world. This is the story of how Denmark's warriors conquered not just with swords, but with England's fear, and how one king's failure to act reshaped the fate of a nation forever. Before the long ships returned, England believed itself safe. The great Viking Age of terror seemed to belong to the past, a memory whispered by monks and written into fragile manuscripts. For nearly a generation, the land had known relative peace. Fields were plowed, markets bustled, and monasteries rang with prayer instead of alarm bells. From Wessex to Mercia, England appeared prosperous, orderly, and whole. Yet beneath this calm surface lay deep fractures. England was not a unified nation in the modern sense. Power was divided among powerful earls, regional loyalties, and competing interests. The king ruled, but he relied heavily on local lords to raise armies and enforce order. When unity was required, hesitation often followed. When speed mattered, debate slowed action to a crawl. The wealth of England, meanwhile, was impossible to hide. Churches overflowed with silver chalices, golden crosses, and offerings gathered over decades. Monasteries stood undefended, symbols of both faith and irresistible temptation. Trade routes carried English silver far beyond its shores, straight into Scandinavian hands. To the north and east, the Viking world was changing. Raiding was no longer the work of scattered warbands, but of organized leaders seeking land, tribute, and kingship. They remembered England well. They remembered how easily it had bled before. Still, many in England believed the old defenses would be enough. The local militia would answer the call. Ships would be gathered when needed. Payments could always buy peace, as they had before. But peace bought with silver is fragile. As the final years of the 10th century approached, England stood rich, divided, and dangerously complacent. The warning signs were there, along the coasts, in foreign ports, in the whispers of merchants, but they went unheeded. The storm was already forming beyond the horizon. History has not been kind to Æthelred's name. For centuries, he has been remembered as Ethelred the Unready, a label that sounds like mockery, as if England's suffering were caused by a foolish or incompetent king. But the truth is more complex and far more tragic. The word unready is a mistranslation. In Old English, Æthelred was called Æthelred Unrad. His name, Æthelred, means noble counsel. Unrad means bad counsel or no counsel. Together, the name forms a bitter pun, noble counsel, badly advised. This was not an insult given during his lifetime, but a judgment passed by history, a verdict on a reign shaped by hesitation, manipulation, and disastrous advice. Æthelred was not stupid, he was not lazy, but he was surrounded by men who pulled him in different directions, each driven by ambition, fear, or self-interest. At court, decisions were endlessly debated. Strategies changed before they could be carried out. Generals were appointed, dismissed, and reappointed. One year, England prepared for war. The next, it paid for peace. The king listened, but he listened to too many voices, and none with clear authority. This failure of counsel mattered more than any single defeat. While Danish leaders acted quickly and decisively, England's responses were slow and confused. Orders arrived late, armies assembled too slowly, fleets were built, then abandoned. Opportunities slipped away, not because Æthelred lacked power, but because he lacked clear direction. The name Unrad captures the heart of his tragedy, a king meant to rule through wisdom, undone by the absence of it. A ruler who wore the crown, but never truly commanded the moment. Æthelred's reign would become a lesson etched into England's memory, that a kingdom can survive strong enemies, but not weak decisions. Æthelred was not meant to rule so young. When the crown passed to him in 978, England placed its future in the hands of a boy barely 10 years old. He sat on the throne not as a seasoned warrior or tested leader, but as a child surrounded by powerful men who claimed to guide him. In reality, they would shape the kingdom in their own image. A child king is always vulnerable. Æthelred could wear the crown, attend ceremonies, and issue commands in name, but real power flowed through the adults around him. Regents, bishops, and noblemen competed for influence, whispering advice that often served themselves more than the realm. Each decision became a struggle between rival factions, and the young king learned early that authority did not guarantee obedience. The weight placed upon him was immense. England was still recovering from earlier Viking devastation, its defenses fragile, its unity uncertain. Yet the responsibility for protecting the kingdom rested on shoulders too young to fully understand the stakes. Æthelred grew up not learning to rule, but learning to survive a court thick with intrigue. This early dependence would define his reign. Instead of developing confidence and decisiveness, Æthelred learned caution. He learned to hesitate, to seek approval, to balance competing voices rather than silence them. What appeared later as weakness was, in many ways, a habit forged in childhood. While Danish leaders rose through battle and command, Æthelred grew through ceremony and counsel. He never had the chance to become a warrior king in the traditional sense. By the time he reached adulthood, the patterns were set. England did not simply gain a young king that year, it gained a reign shaped by insecurity from the very beginning. And when crisis came, as it surely would, the lessons of Æthelred's childhood would return to haunt both king and kingdom alike. Æthelred's reign began under a shadow that never truly lifted. Before he wore the crown, England belonged to his half-brother, Edward the Martyr, a young king remembered for his piety and quiet authority. In 978, Edward rode to Corfe Castle to visit his stepmother, Queen Æthelred, and his younger brother, Ethelred. He never left alive. Struck down while still on his horse, Edward died suddenly, violently, and under circumstances that raised immediate suspicion. No court ever proved who ordered the murder. No blade was officially named. Yet in the minds of the people, doubt hardened into belief. Edward's death was too convenient,
too close to the ambitions of those who benefited most from his removal. And at the center of that storm stood the boy who would become king. Ethelred may not have planned the killing. He may not have understood it at all. But his coronation followed so quickly that many saw the crown as stained before it ever touched his head. Whispers spread through monasteries and noble halls alike. This was a king raised on blood. The church reacted swiftly. Edward was declared a martyr, his tomb becoming a place of pilgrimage. Miracles were reported, saints were born from tragedy. And with every prayer spoken in Edward's name, Ethelred's legitimacy weakened. How could God favor a king whose rule followed such a crime? This suspicion mattered deeply in a world where kingship was bound to divine approval. A ruler doubted by the church was a ruler weakened at the core. Loyalty became conditional, obedience became negotiable. From the very beginning, Ethelred ruled not as a chosen leader, but as a questioned one. His authority was fragile, his position contested, not by open rebellion, but by quiet mistrust. The murder of Edward the Martyr did more than end one reign. It poisoned the next, casting a long, silent shadow over every decision Ethelred would make and every failure his enemies would eagerly remember.
Æthelred's crown rested uneasily on his head. Though crowned king, he inherited more than a throne. He inherited suspicion. The bloodshed that ended Edward the Martyr's life clung to Æthelred's reign like a stain that could never be washed away. In the eyes of many, England had not simply lost a king, it had broken a sacred order. Anglo-Saxon kingship depended on legitimacy. A king was not just a ruler by force, but a guardian chosen by God. Edward's violent death shattered that belief. When Æthelred took the throne, whispers followed him into every hall and church. Was this God's will, or the result of murder and ambition? This doubt weakened him in ways no army could. Powerful earls obeyed, but not wholeheartedly. Bishops advised, but with caution. Loyalty became fragile, conditional, and easily withdrawn. In moments of crisis, men hesitated, not because they lacked courage, but because they questioned the king they were asked to fight for. Æthelred responded as many insecure rulers do, by trying to assert control through punishment and suspicion rather than trust. He rewarded loyalty harshly and punished perceived betrayal even harsher. Over time, fear replaced respect at court. Instead of uniting his nobles, he drove wedges between them. This fragile legitimacy also shaped his decisions against the Danes. A king unsure of his authority avoids bold risks. He listens too long. He compromises when he should command. He pays where he should fight. Each choice was shaped by the knowledge that failure could invite rebellion as easily as invasion. The crown Æthelred wore was heavy, not because of its gold, but because of what lay beneath it. Every raid, every defeat, every payment of silver reopened the old wound of Edward's death. England was ruled by a king who could never fully escape his beginning. A crown built on blood is never stable, and as the Danish threat grew, the cracks in Æthelred's kingship widened, ready to split the kingdom apart. The first signs of trouble appeared along England's eastern shores. Small, swift ships with red sails cut through the misty morning waters, their prows shaped like dragon heads. These were not mere merchants or fishermen. They were Danes, seasoned raiders who had not forgotten the riches of England. Their arrival sparked panic in coastal villages, where smoke from burned huts soon darkened the horizon. Æthelred, still young and inexperienced,
faced the stark reality of invasion for the first time. Scouts returned with fragmented reports, villages destroyed, livestock stolen, monks and townspeople killed or taken as slaves. Local leaders, unsure of who held ultimate command, attempted to gather militia, but the responses were slow, disorganized, and easily scattered by the raiders' speed. England's defenses, once considered formidable, now seemed inadequate. These initial raids were small in scale, but devastating in impact. The Danes did not yet seek to conquer. They sought wealth, terror, and the perception that England was vulnerable. Æthelred's advisors debated whether to confront the raiders with force or attempt to buy them off. The king, uncertain whom to trust and how to act decisively, chose compromise over confrontation, an early example of the pattern that would define his reign. The raids revealed more than England's military weaknesses. They exposed fractures in loyalty and leadership. Earls hesitated to act without explicit royal command. Local populations questioned whether their king could protect them. News of the destruction traveled quickly, reaching towns hundreds of miles inland, sowing fear far beyond the coasts. By the time the Danes sailed away, leaving behind charred villages and stolen wealth, a dangerous precedent had been set. England could be raided at will. The first Danish strikes were a warning, a test of Æthelred's resolve, and the opening chapter of a reign increasingly defined by indecision and the struggle to defend a kingdom that seemed already slipping from his grasp.
When the Danish raiders returned, England's weaknesses were laid bare. The kingdom was vast, stretching from the Scottish border in the north to the marshlands of Wessex in the south. On paper, it had armies, fortified towns, and a network of fyrds, local militias that could be called upon to defend the realm. In practice, England was fragmented, its defenses divided by politics, pride, and geography. The problem began with the earls, the regional lords tasked with raising armies in times of crisis. Each earl answered first to his own interests and only secondarily to the king. Some were loyal, some ambitious, and others indifferent. Coordination was rare. Commands from Æthelred often arrived too late or were ignored entirely. Messages traveled slowly across the kingdom, leaving local commanders to make split-second decisions without guidance. By the time a united force could assemble, the Danes were long gone, leaving devastation in their wake. England's fortifications, too, were inconsistent. Major towns like London and Winchester had walls and garrisons, but many smaller settlements were little more than clusters of timber homes with thatched roofs. Villages could be sacked in hours, and rivers and marshes, which might have slowed the invaders, were poorly patrolled. Even the fyrd, the backbone of England's defense, was unreliable. Farmers and peasants called to arms were often reluctant, poorly trained, and poorly equipped. When confronted with the speed and ferocity of the Danish raids, many fled, leaving commanders with empty ranks. This fractured system left England vulnerable. While the Danes attacked in calculated waves, the English response was reactive, slow, and uncoordinated. Each raid became a lesson in failure, not for the enemy, but for a kingdom unable to defend itself from within. England's defenses, meant to protect, instead highlighted the growing crisis of leadership and unity under Æthelred's troubled reign.
Æthelred's greatest challenge was not the Danish raiders, but the voices that surrounded him. From the moment he came of age, the young king relied heavily on his advisors, bishops, earls, and trusted nobles to guide his decisions. Yet in a court filled with ambition, jealousy, and fear, good counsel was rare. Every suggestion carried hidden motives, and every piece of advice was filtered through personal agendas. Some counselors urged caution, warning against direct confrontation with the Danes. Others demanded action, advocating for swift military strikes. Some sought peace through tribute, seeing silver as a shortcut to safety. Others recommended ruthless punishment, hoping to demonstrate strength. Æthelred, unsure whom to trust, often attempted to follow all advice at once, or none at all. The result was indecision. This poor counsel had disastrous consequences. One year, fleets were raised too late to intercept raiders. Another year, money was paid in tribute, only to encourage further attacks. Nobles argued over strategy, while villages burned. Æthelred's own reputation suffered. He appeared weak, uncertain, and manipulated by those around him. Even when advisors disagreed openly, the king rarely imposed his own authority. He deferred to the loudest voices, or those with the most influence, rather than those with the clearest understanding of strategy. This culture of flawed guidance permeated every level of government, shaping military, fiscal, and legal decisions alike. The court, meant to be a center of strength, became a hall of confusion. Decisions were delayed, poorly executed, or entirely contradictory. England suffered not because of a lack of resources or courage, but because the king's judgment was undermined by the very people entrusted to advise him. Poor counsel at court turned potential victories into defeats and sowed the seeds for the long series of disasters that would define Æthelred's reign. By the turn of the millennium, Æthelred's reign was defined not by courage or strategy, but by hesitation and indecision. England faced repeated Danish incursions, yet its king seemed incapable of decisive action. Leadership, the very essence of kingship, was failing at the highest level. A leader must inspire confidence, unify forces, and act decisively in times of crisis. Æthelred could do none of these consistently. Orders were often delayed, contradictory, or never enforced. When raids struck the coast, local commanders waited for permission that arrived too late. Fleets were assembled and disbanded with alarming frequency. Soldiers lacked coordination, supplies, and clear objectives. Even victories, when they occurred, were short-lived because no long-term strategy existed. This failure extended beyond the battlefield. The king's attempts to manage internal politics only deepened divisions. Earls and nobles acted independently, undermining central authority. Councils argued endlessly, paralyzing decision-making. Taxes and tributes were raised haphazardly, fueling resentment rather than loyalty. Common people began to doubt that their king could protect them, eroding the social fabric that held the kingdom together. Æthelred's leadership was reactive rather than proactive. He responded to crises, but never anticipated them. He attempted to buy peace with silver, yet this only invited further aggression. He sought to punish disloyalty, yet often targeted the wrong people, creating fear instead of respect. In the end, the king's failure was not a single mistake, but a pattern, a consistent inability to act when action was required most. England's enemies recognized it, exploiting it ruthlessly. Within his own court, suspicion and discord flourished. Æthelred wore the crown, yet the crown alone could not make him a king in the truest sense. The nation's fate would increasingly mirror the weakness at its heart, a king unable to lead when leadership mattered most. Æthelred's first response to the growing Danish threat was not the sword, it was silver. Confronted with repeated raids and an army that often failed to assemble in time, he made a decision that would define his reign. He chose to pay the enemy rather than fight them. This payment, later known as Danegeld, was meant to buy peace, but it carried consequences far beyond the immediate relief it provided. At first, Danegeld seemed practical. Coins flowed from English coffers into the hands of Danish chieftains, who, temporarily appeased, withdrew their longships. Villages were spared destruction, and towns breathed a brief sigh of relief. For the king, it appeared to be a solution, a way to protect his people while avoiding the risk of a battle he might not win. But peace bought with gold is fragile. The Danes quickly realized that England could be manipulated. Payment became a predictable pattern. The more Æthelred gave, the more they demanded. What was meant to be a short-term solution soon turned into an expectation, and England's silver flowed continuously across the North Sea. The economy strained under the heavy taxation required to fund these tributes, sowing resentment among nobles and commoners alike. Worse still, paying the enemy undermined Æthelred's authority. To many, the king appeared weak, a ruler who could be bought rather than a protector of his people. His indecision and reliance on money over military strategy emboldened the Danes. Each tribute sent a clear message: England feared invasion, and its king lacked the will to stop it. The Danegeld, though intended to secure temporary safety, ultimately invited further raids. England was richer in silver, but poorer in security, respect, and stability. In trying to buy peace, Æthelred unintentionally set the stage for deeper chaos, ensuring that the threat of Danish conquest would grow, not diminish. By the end of the 10th century, Æthelred had established a dangerous pattern. When faced with Danish raiders, he often reached for gold instead of steel. Rather than mobilizing armies or fortifying towns, he opted to pay tribute, believing silver could substitute for strategy. What seemed a practical solution in the moment would prove disastrous in the long term. The king's payments, Danegeld, were enormous. Coins collected from taxed peasants, merchants, and monasteries were sent across the North Sea to the Danish invaders. In theory, this was meant to buy temporary peace. The raiders would leave and the kingdom could rebuild. But the Danes were not simple mercenaries. They recognized that England's king could be coerced. Gold became a lure, not a deterrent. Each payment invited further raids, and each raid demanded more tribute. England's wealth flowed steadily into enemy hands, while protection remained uncertain. This reliance on money over force eroded respect for Ætheldred's rule. Nobles questioned the wisdom of a king who chose bribes over battles, and commoners resented the heavy taxes required to fund these payments. England's strength, its armies, its local militias, its fortifications remained underutilized. The king's hesitations signaled weakness, and his enemies adjusted their strategies accordingly. The choice of gold over steel also left a psychological mark. Villagers and townspeople, once confident in their defenses, began to fear that no walls or soldiers could protect them. The Danes, conversely, grew bolder, knowing England preferred payment to confrontation. Ætheldred's reign demonstrates a crucial lesson in leadership. Wealth alone cannot substitute for decisive action. By prioritizing silver over strategy, he bought only temporary safety while ensuring long-term vulnerability. England's enemies learned that gold could open doors that steel could not, and the kingdom would soon pay the price. By the turn of the millennium, England had become a beacon for ambitious invaders. Its wealth, fertile lands, and fragmented defenses made it an irresistible target for the Danes. Stories of monasteries overflowing with silver, towns rich with trade, and undefended villages traveled across the North Sea, reaching the ears of ambitious chieftains and seasoned warriors eager for conquest. England's prosperity, once its pride, had become a liability. The Danes had learned from previous raids that the kingdom could be plundered repeatedly with minimal risk. The payment of Danegeld only confirmed their suspicions. England's rulers were willing to sacrifice treasure for temporary peace rather than risk open battle. This created a dangerous cycle. Each tribute paid emboldened the invaders and weakened the kingdom's ability to resist. The kingdom's political disunity further amplified its vulnerability. Earls acted independently, often prioritizing local concerns over national defense. Orders from Æthelred arrived inconsistently, sometimes delayed by months, leaving regions exposed while raiders struck at will. The king's reliance on counsel, his indecision, and the lack of a coordinated military response only heightened England's appeal to enemies. Even beyond immediate wealth, England offered strategic advantages. Its ports and rivers provided easy access for fleets, while its central towns offered bases from which to launch further raids. The Danes recognized that a successful conquest could yield not just treasure, but lasting power. By the early 1000s, England had transformed in the eyes of the Viking world, from a respected kingdom to a vulnerable prize. Its silver, lands, and weakly enforced laws broadcast a single message to potential invaders. Here lies a nation rich in resources, divided by politics, and led by a king hesitant to act. England had become a target, not merely for raiding, but for domination. The danger looming over its shores was no longer occasional, it was existential. As Æthelred's reign continued, the payments to the Danes, known as Danegeld, became more than a temporary solution. They became a crushing burden on England itself. Initially meant to buy peace, these tributes soon demanded ever-increasing sums of silver and gold, extracted from a kingdom already stretched thin by repeated raids and internal unrest. The financial strain was immense. Taxes were levied on peasants, merchants, and nobles alike, draining wealth from communities while providing little in return. Monasteries, once centers of learning and spiritual life, were stripped of treasures, sacred vessels, and precious metals. Commoners bore the weight of levies that forced them to part with savings meant for survival. As England paid again and again, the silver flowed steadily to Danish coffers, yet the raiders continued to return, emboldened by the ease of extortion. Danegeld also carried political consequences. Local lords grumbled at the heavy taxation, questioning the king's ability to protect the kingdom and manage resources effectively. Resentment grew among the populace, and loyalty to Æthelred weakened. Communities began to fear that their king could not defend them without relying on repeated payments, creating a climate of insecurity and dissatisfaction that spread across the land. The burden was more than financial. England's confidence eroded with each tribute. Paying the Danes reinforced their perception of weakness and created a dangerous precedent. Wealth could substitute for force. Æthelred's repeated payments undermined his authority and encouraged further aggression, while leaving England poorer, exhausted, and divided. Ultimately, the Danegeld did not purchase lasting peace. It merely delayed confrontation, sacrificing the kingdom's wealth and stability for a fleeting sense of security. England paid with silver, and in doing so, prepared the ground for greater suffering at the hands of a determined enemy. As the Danish threat intensified, Æthelred faced a danger more insidious than foreign raiders: betrayal from within his own kingdom. England's strength relied heavily on its earls and local commanders, men entrusted with raising armies, defending towns, and coordinating responses to invasion. Yet during Æthelred's reign, loyalty was fragile, and ambition often outweighed duty. Some earls, resentful of the king's authority, or fearful of the consequences of resisting the Danes, abandoned their posts at critical moments. Fleets were assembled but never deployed, and soldiers marched only to return home in fear or frustration. In other cases, commanders openly switched sides, aligning with the Danes to protect their own lands or secure personal gain. This betrayal turned England's defenses into a patchwork of compliance and defection, leaving vast regions vulnerable. Even within Æthelred's court, counsel was unreliable. Advisors plotted against one another, offering conflicting strategies that sowed confusion. Some sought to manipulate the king for personal advantage, deliberately providing poor advice to weaken rivals. Æthelred, already hesitant and inexperienced, often accepted these recommendations, unaware of the hidden motives behind them. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Coordinated resistance became nearly impossible. When Danish raiders attacked, local militias either failed to arrive or fought half-heartedly. Fortified towns, instead of standing as bastions, were left exposed. Entire regions fell, not solely because of the invaders' strength, but because England's own leaders refused to act decisively or acted in their own interest. Betrayal from within eroded trust and morale across the kingdom. Æthelred's authority was undermined not just by external threat, but by the unreliability of those closest to him. England's greatest vulnerability lay not in the sword of the enemy, but in the fractured loyalty of its own people, a fracture that would continue to haunt the kingdom throughout his troubled reign.
By the early 1000s, Æthelred's reign was marked not only by external threats, but by an inner turmoil that grew steadily with each raid, paranoia. The young king, already burdened by the shadow of his brother's death and the failures of his early rule, became increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. Advisors whispered, nobles schemed, and even loyal commanders were viewed with doubt. In Æthelred's eyes, betrayal lurked behind every counsel, every report, and every act of defiance. This paranoia shaped his decisions. Trusted nobles were dismissed or replaced, sometimes for minor infractions, sometimes for imagined slights. Councils, once meant to guide strategy, turned into arenas of accusation and fear. Earls hesitated to act without explicit royal approval, worried that any misstep could provoke Ætheled's wrath. The king's uncertainty slowed every response to the Danish threat, leaving England exposed to raids that might have been stopped with decisive action. Paranoia also affected his relationship with the church. Monks and bishops, once advisors and allies, were viewed with suspicion if they questioned his policies or refused to sanction his controversial decisions. England's spiritual authority, which could have bolstered the king's legitimacy, instead became another source of tension. Even within the royal household, Ætheled's distrust grew. Courtiers were watched, messengers scrutinized, and foreign envoys treated warily. Every failure, every raid, every payment to the Danes reinforced his sense that he could trust no one. This growing paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By doubting those around him, Æthelred weakened the very structures he depended on for defense. Loyalty eroded, communication broke down, and England's response to invasion became slower and less coordinated. In the end, the king's fear undermined his authority more than any sword or longship ever could, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to enemies and internal strife alike.
On November 13, 1002, Æthelred the Unready made a decision that would haunt his reign forever: the St. Brice's Day massacre. In a desperate bid to halt Danish influence within England, he ordered the killing of all Danes living on English soil. Men, women, and children were targeted, an act meant to remove potential threats but which instead unleashed chaos and vengeance. The rationale behind the massacre was fear. Æthelred had received warnings that Danes living in England might rise against him or aid incoming raiders. He saw betrayal lurking in every Danish household, and in his growing paranoia, he believed preemptive violence was the only solution. Yet the brutality of the order shocked the kingdom. Communities were torn apart, trust shattered, and the moral authority of the king questioned. Monasteries and towns became unwilling witnesses to bloodshed, and even loyal nobles struggled to reconcile obedience with conscience. The immediate effect of the massacre was horror and outrage. Families were decimated, Danish merchants and settlers slain without trial, and the sense of safety among England's population collapsed. More importantly, the long-term consequences proved disastrous. News of the killings spread across the North Sea to Denmark, where King Sweyn Forkbeard, already eyeing England, swore revenge. What Æthelred hoped would secure his realm only strengthened his enemy's resolve. The St. Brice's Day massacre illustrates a recurring theme in Æthelred's reign: reaction fueled by fear rather than strategy. By choosing violence over diplomacy or coordinated defense, the king deepened divisions within his kingdom and provoked retaliation that would later culminate in Danish conquest. England had not only lost innocent lives that day, it had sown the seeds of vengeance that would shadow Æthelred's rule to its bitter end, proving that fear-driven decisions can be as deadly as foreign swords. The St. Brice's Day massacre was only the beginning of a series of fatal decisions that would define Æthelred's reign. In the aftermath, he faced the full consequences of his actions, yet his choices continued to compound the kingdom's peril. England was already weakened by repeated raids, fractured loyalties, and mounting Danegeld payments. Instead of addressing these vulnerabilities strategically, Æthelred often acted out of fear and reaction, setting the stage for disaster. King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, outraged by the massacre of his countrymen, began to plan a decisive response. Æthelred, however, remained slow to act. Rather than strengthening coastal defenses, mobilizing his armies, or forging alliances, he continued to rely on tribute payments and temporary expedients. Each day of hesitation allowed Sweyn's forces to organize, gather ships, and strike with precision. England's vulnerability grew with every misstep. Even within the king's own court, Æthelred's decisions caused unrest. Earls and commanders were uncertain whom to trust or follow. Some prepared for rebellion rather than defense. Councils dissolved into disputes over strategy and loyalty, while common people watched helplessly as villages and towns remained exposed to attack. The king's authority, already fragile, eroded further with every perceived misjudgment. This fatal decision-making reflected a deeper problem: Æthelred's inability to act decisively when stakes were highest. The massacre had provoked enemies, and his continued reliance on avoidance and compromise ensured that England could not effectively respond. By failing to address the threats to his kingdom proactively, the king allowed Sweyn to turn anger into conquest. In history, Æthelred's reign is remembered not for victories or bold leadership, but for choices that weakened England from within. His pattern of reactionary, fear-driven decisions became a fatal legacy, one that would cost the kingdom dearly and invite the very conquest he hoped to prevent. The events of St. Brice's Day sent shockwaves far beyond England's shores. Across the North Sea, word reached King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark that his countrymen, men, women, and children who had lived peacefully in England, had been slaughtered on the orders of Æthelred. What had been a strategic, if brutal, attempt to secure England became a personal affront to the Danish crown. Sweyn's fury ignited a campaign of vengeance
that would reshape the future of the kingdom. Sweyn, a seasoned warrior and cunning strategist, recognized the opportunity that England's internal divisions presented. Æthelred's indecision, reliance on tributes, and fractured leadership had made the kingdom vulnerable. Now, anger and ambition combined in Sweyn's mind. This was no longer a raid for plunder. It was a conquest fueled by righteous wrath. The Danes began to amass fleets, gathering experienced warriors and seasoned leaders, all motivated not just by wealth, but by the desire to punish the man who had dared to kill their people. England, meanwhile, remained unaware of the magnitude of the threat. Coastal towns, already wary from previous raids, braced for the unknown. Æthelred continued to rely on delayed councils and fragmented local militias. His spies reported rumors, but the king struggled to distinguish panic from reality. Meanwhile, Sweyn's forces crossed the North Sea, trained in warfare and united by vengeance. The wrath of Denmark would not be appeased by Danegeld or timid defenses. Every village destroyed and every silver coin demanded only reinforced Sweyn's resolve. Æthelred's kingdom, rich but divided, faced an enemy unlike any before, calculated, determined, and fueled by the personal fury of a king who would not forgive. England's fate now hung in the balance, teetering between tribute and total conquest. The Danish king had come not to negotiate, but to punish. In the early years of the 11th century, the warnings became reality. The great Danish invasion had begun. Sweyn Forkbeard, fueled by outrage over the St. Brice's Day massacre and ambition for conquest, launched a massive fleet toward England. Unlike previous raids, this was no fleeting strike for plunder. It was a coordinated, strategic campaign aimed at seizing the crown. Hundreds of longships, carrying thousands of battle-hardened warriors, cut through the misty waters of the North Sea, each vessel a symbol of Denmark's intent. England's defenses, already fractured and overstretched, struggled to respond. Local militias, untrained and poorly equipped, were called up in haste, while the King's Council debated endlessly over where to deploy forces. Orders from Æthelred were delayed, often contradictory, and sometimes ignored altogether. Coastal towns tried to prepare, erecting barricades and fortifying walls, but the sheer scale of the Danish fleet rendered these efforts insufficient. The sense of impending doom spread quickly, reaching villages far from the coast. People fled their homes, abandoning fields and towns in terror. The invaders moved with precision. Sweyn's commanders coordinated attacks along multiple fronts, testing England's response and targeting weak points. Villages were plundered, churches looted, and resistance crushed wherever it appeared. Unlike earlier raids, which could be repelled or negotiated, this invasion sought not tribute, but submission. England faced an organized enemy that had learned from past failures, combining ruthlessness with tactical skill. For Æthelred, the invasion was a test of leadership he was ill-prepared to meet. Decisions were slow, resources mismanaged, and local leaders divided. As the Danish longships appeared on the horizon, it became clear that England was facing not a raid, but a full-scale assault. The great invasion had begun, marking the start of a relentless campaign that would challenge every strength, every loyalty, and every decision of the king. England's survival hung by a thread.
As Sweyn Forkbeard's forces advanced deeper into England, the kingdom's defenses began to unravel. The English armies, hastily assembled from local militias and noble levies, were ill-prepared to face a coordinated, professional Danish force. Lack of training, poor equipment, and inconsistent leadership combined with Æthelred's indecision to create chaos on the battlefield.
What should have been a united front became a series of fragmented, disorganized confrontations, each more disastrous than the last. Local earls, tasked with raising troops, often failed to mobilize on time, and when they did, the forces were incomplete or poorly equipped. Some commanders abandoned their posts entirely, either out of fear or self-interest, leaving gaps in the defenses that the Danes exploited ruthlessly. Messages and orders from Æthelred were slow to arrive, sometimes arriving after battles had already begun, or worse, after defeat had been suffered. England's armies, meant to repel invaders, crumbled before them. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Towns and villages fell with little resistance. Fields were looted, churches burned, and civilians captured or slaughtered. The psychological impact of repeated military failures further eroded morale among both soldiers and citizens. Reports of one collapse would reach other regions, spreading panic and weakening resolve before the Danes even arrived. Æthelred, watching from the safety of his court, struggled to coordinate any meaningful defense. The king's authority, already fragile, suffered as nobles questioned his competence. England's military infrastructure, under strain and poorly led, proved incapable of resisting the calculated, relentless attacks of Sweyn's forces. The collapse of the English armies marked a turning point. The kingdom was no longer merely under threat, it was vulnerable to total conquest. The failures on the battlefield reflected not only the skill of the Danish invaders, but the weaknesses of Æthelred's leadership, the unreliability of his nobles, and the fractured state of England itself. England's fate teetered on the edge of disaster. As Sweyn Forkbeard's forces pressed into England, the kingdom's cities began to fall one by one, each loss marking another blow to Æthelred's authority. Unlike previous raids, these attacks were not haphazard or opportunistic. They were strategic, coordinated, and ruthless. The Danes struck at towns that were poorly defended, cutting off any chance for organized resistance. Walls that had once been a symbol of security now proved insufficient against an enemy who combined experience with planning and sheer numbers. London, the heart of England, held out longer than most. Its walls and river defenses slowed Sweyn's advance, providing a brief glimmer of hope. Yet outside the capital, smaller towns and fortified settlements were abandoned or destroyed. Norwich, Winchester, and other key regional centers were sacked. Merchants were killed or captured, churches looted, and homes burned. The psychological impact was profound. Each fallen city sent waves of fear to the next, weakening morale and spreading panic across the countryside. Æthelred, trapped in indecision, struggled to respond effectively. His orders arrived late or were ignored. Local militias often fled rather than fought, and loyalty among earls fractured further under the pressure of repeated defeats. Tributes and negotiations, which had once been his preferred method of buying peace, now proved futile. The Danes were no longer content with silver, they sought domination, and the repeated collapses of English towns demonstrated that Æthelred could neither protect nor lead his people decisively. The fall of each city was more than a military setback. It was a symbolic unraveling of England's authority. With every town taken, Sweyn's forces strengthened their foothold, consolidating control and inspiring further raids. By the time they approached London, the kingdom's defenses were exhausted, its leadership discredited, and its people demoralized. England was slipping from Æthelred's grasp, city by city, as the Danish conquest of the realm became increasingly inevitable. By the height of the Danish invasion, Æthelred's grip on England had all but vanished. The king who had inherited a troubled realm as a child now struggled to command even the loyalty of his own nobles. Earls acted independently, raising their own forces or withholding them entirely, while local militias dissolved under pressure. Orders from the throne were often delayed, ignored, or misinterpreted, leaving towns and villages to fend for themselves against a ruthless and organized enemy. Ethelred's reliance on fear, punishment, and tribute had undermined the very foundations of leadership. The Danes no longer feared the English crown. They recognized that silver could be extorted and indecision could be exploited. Villagers fled at the first sign of longships, and towns negotiated surrenders with minimal resistance, knowing that the king could not guarantee protection. His authority, once symbolized by the crown and the law, was now hollow. Paranoia further weakened the king's rule. Ethelred suspected treachery at every turn, dismissing or punishing advisors and commanders who might have helped coordinate a defense. Councils descended into chaos, with conflicting strategies paralyzing action. While the enemy struck with precision, the king's forces were scattered, uncoordinated, and increasingly demoralized. The collapse of control was not sudden, but cumulative. Decade-long patterns of indecision, poor counsel, and reactive leadership had eroded trust across the kingdom. By the time Sweyn's fleets roamed the coast and raiders swept inland, Ethelred's England was a kingdom in name only, wealthy, fractured, and leaderless in practice. Losing control was more than a political failure, it was a psychological defeat. England's people no longer looked to their king for guidance or protection. His inability to unify the realm or command respect created a vacuum that the Danes exploited relentlessly. By the end of this phase of the invasion, Æthelred had become a ruler in title alone, while the kingdom he was meant to protect teetered on the brink of conquest.
By 1013, Æthelred the Unready faced a reality he could no longer deny. England was slipping from his grasp. Sweyn Forkbeard's relentless campaigns had devastated towns, defeated armies, and shattered the confidence of nobles and commoners alike. The king who had once ruled from Wessex and Winchester now found himself powerless to stop the tide of conquest. With defeat looming, Æthelred made the fateful decision to flee the kingdom. He sought refuge across the North Sea, leaving England in a state of uncertainty and fear. His departure was not a triumphant retreat, but a desperate attempt to preserve his life and the remnants of his authority. For the people of England, the king's flight was a profound shock. The man who bore the crown, who had been the kingdom's protector, even if ineffectively, vanished when his leadership was needed most. Anxiety spread as news traveled from village to village. The king had abandoned them to the invaders. Æthelred's nobles, already fractured by years of weak leadership and poor counsel, scrambled to maintain order. Some attempted to negotiate with Sweyn, others fortified their own holdings, and many simply prepared for the inevitable. England, rich in resources but leaderless, became increasingly vulnerable to Danish occupation. The king's flight also sent a message across Europe. England's leadership was unstable, its authority questioned, and its defenses unreliable. Foreign powers and potential allies now viewed the kingdom as a prize ripe for exploitation. Æthelred's retreat preserved his life but ceded immediate control of England, leaving him reliant on external support to reclaim the throne. In fleeing, Æthelred faced a bitter truth. A king's crown carries little weight without power to enforce it. His departure marked not just a tactical withdrawal, but the symbolic collapse of English resistance and the beginning of a new chapter in the Danish conquest of the realm.
Ethelred gone, and England weakened by years of raids, betrayal, and failed leadership, Sweyn Forkbeard seized his opportunity. In late 1013, the Danish king crossed the North Sea not as a raider,
but as a conqueror, claiming the crown of England. After decades of intermittent conflict, Sweyn's forces had secured enough territory and loyalty from English nobles to make his rule a reality. The coronation was both a triumph and a statement. By placing a crown on his head, Sweyn transformed from a feared invader into a legitimate ruler, signaling to England and the wider world that Danish authority now extended over the island. Local leaders, recognizing the futility of resistance, pledged allegiance to the new king, some out of fear, others out of pragmatism. England's cities, many still recovering from plunder, offered formal submission, and Sweyn's rule seemed secure. Yet his kingship was precarious. The kingdom, he claimed, had been devastated by raids, weakened by internal division, and stripped of confidence in its own leadership. Ethelred's flight had left a power vacuum, but loyalty to the previous dynasty still lingered among the English people. Monks and nobles remembered Edward the Martyr and questioned the legitimacy of foreign rule. Sweyn's challenge was not only to maintain control militarily, but to establish authority over a population wary of conquest and bloodshed. Despite these challenges, the coronation symbolized a turning point. For the first time, Denmark had successfully extended its kingship over England, turning decades of raids and tribute into formal rule. Sweyn's rise illustrated the consequences of Ethelred's indecision and failures. A kingdom rich in wealth, but fractured in loyalty, could not withstand a determined and organized enemy. The English crown had changed hands, marking a new era and signaling the cost of weak leadership in times of relentless crisis. After fleeing England in 1013, Æthelred the Unready found himself a king in name only, wandering the courts of Normandy and seeking refuge among allies. The man who had once ruled from Winchester and London now lived in exile, stripped of authority, wealth, and the ability to protect the kingdom he had inherited. His life became a mixture of fear, frustration, and desperate planning as he struggled to regain what had been lost to Sweyn Forkbeard. Æthelred's exile was marked by isolation and dependency. In Normandy, he relied on the hospitality of Duke Richard II, whose support was conditional and politically calculated. He had allies, yes, but none who could restore him to power without risk. Letters and envoys were sent back to England, urging loyalty and plotting potential uprisings, yet the king's absence weakened the credibility of these efforts. Without boots on the ground, armies could not be raised, fortresses could not be reinforced, and local leaders often deferred to Sweyn's authority rather than risk backing a distant and vulnerable ruler. Living in exile also took a psychological toll. Æthelred, already cautious and hesitant by nature, became increasingly dependent on advisors whose counsel was colored by ambition or fear. Each decision was shadowed by uncertainty. Could he trust his hosts? Would England respond to his appeals? Could he muster enough support to reclaim the throne? The king's dreams of returning to England were constantly tempered by the reality of a kingdom now under foreign control. Yet even in exile, Æthelred was not entirely powerless. He began to organize alliances, gather intelligence, and plan his eventual return. His time abroad would teach him lessons in diplomacy, patience, and the harsh realities of leadership. Exile became both punishment and preparation, a period of reflection for a king whose failures at home had nearly destroyed him, yet who remained determined to reclaim his crown and his kingdom. The unexpected struck in 1014. Sweyn Forkbeard, the conqueror who had seized the English crown, died suddenly. The circumstances remain unclear. Some chroniclers claimed illness, others whispered poison, but the effect on England was immediate and profound. Sweyn's death created a power vacuum in a kingdom still reeling from years of raids, conquest, and political instability. For Ethelred, now in exile, the news was both shocking and providential. After years of fleeing, planning, and watching Sweyn consolidate power, the former king saw a sudden opportunity to reclaim his throne. Sweyn's death destabilized Danish authority. Local leaders and nobles who had pledged loyalty to him were uncertain whom to support next. The transition of power to Sweyn's son, Cnut, was not automatic, and internal divisions among the Danes weakened their hold on England. Sweyn's passing also altered the mood of the English people. Though they had endured conquest and occupation, Sweyn's sudden death rekindled hope that the kingdom could return to native rule. Monks, nobles, and local leaders began to consider the possibility of reinstating Ethelred, whose flight had left them leaderless for months. England's fractured loyalties now tilted back toward the former king, and the memory of his failures was temporarily overshadowed by the promise of restoration. Yet the opportunity was fleeting. Ethelred's own weaknesses, hesitation, reliance on poor counsel, and indecision remained unchanged. Even as he prepared to return, he faced the daunting task of rallying a kingdom exhausted by Danish occupation and deeply divided by years of mistrust. Sweyn's sudden death was a moment of chance, a crack in the armor of conquest, but it would take decisive action and not merely fortune for Ethelred to reclaim authority. The stage was set for a tense and uncertain return, where England's future would hang in the balance once more. In 1014, following the sudden death of Sweyn Forkbeard, Æthelred the Unready saw the long-awaited opportunity to reclaim his kingdom. England, exhausted by Danish conquest and weakened by years of mismanagement, appeared ready to welcome its native king back. Yet Æthelred's return would not be a triumphant march. It was a calculated, tense endeavor, fraught with uncertainty and danger. Crossing the North Sea from Normandy, Æthelred relied on a combination of diplomacy, alliances, and careful timing. He knew that many English nobles had pledged loyalty to Sweyn, and that some might resist his restoration. Yet others, weary of foreign rule and inspired by hope for a return to native leadership, quietly rallied in his favor. Æthelred moved cautiously, sending envoys ahead to negotiate the allegiance of earls and commanders, ensuring that his arrival would be supported rather than opposed. When he finally set foot on English soil, it was in a climate of cautious optimism. Crowds greeted him with relief and hope, though whispers of past failures and indecision lingered. Æthelred had learned during his exile, diplomacy, persuasion, and careful management of loyalty were as crucial as military strength. His advisors, chosen with more care than in previous years, helped him navigate a kingdom still fragmented by fear, mistrust, and occupation. Even so, the king faced immediate challenges. Danish forces loyal to Sweyn's son, Cnut, remained active, threatening rebellion and raids. Local towns and fortresses damaged during Sweyn's conquest required rebuilding and garrisoning. Æthelred's task was immense. He had returned to a throne weakened by years of chaos, a kingdom wary of his leadership, and enemies both foreign and domestic prepared to test him. Æthelred's return marked a fragile restoration. For the first time in over a decade, England had its native king again, but the shadow of his past failures and the looming Danish threat ensured that his reign would continue to be a delicate struggle for survival, loyalty, and authority. After reclaiming the throne in 1014, Æthelred the Unready faced a kingdom battered by years of Danish raids, political betrayal, and internal chaos. Recognizing that his past failures had eroded trust among nobles, clergy, and commoners alike, he knew that mere return was not enough. To secure his position, Æthelred began making promises of reform, pledging to restore order, strengthen defenses, and govern with greater wisdom. In councils convened soon after his return, the king emphasized unity. He addressed the grievances of the earls, who had previously felt ignored or undermined, offering them clearer authority over local militias while asserting royal oversight. Monks and bishops were promised protection and respect, aiming to repair the strained relationship between crown and church. By publicly acknowledging past mistakes, Æthelred sought to rebuild the fragile legitimacy that had been questioned since the murder of Edward the Martyr and the repeated failures against the Danes. The king's promises extended beyond politics and religion. He pledged to reform England's military structure, advocating for more disciplined local militias and better coordinated defense strategies along vulnerable coasts. Recognizing that Danegeld had undermined confidence, he vowed to reserve tribute payments for extreme emergencies, emphasizing preparation and resistance over appeasement. Despite these promises, skepticism lingered. Nobles remembered the indecision, mismanagement, and fear-driven decisions that had plagued his earlier reign. Commoners, who had endured decades of raids, taxation, and destruction, were wary of trusting a king who had once fled in the face of invasion. Yet Æthelred's words signaled intent, a recognition that authority needed restoration not just through crowns and armies, but through accountability, planning, and reform. The promises of reform were Æthelred's attempt to chart a new course, to rebuild loyalty, strengthen defenses, and prove that the failures of the past could be corrected. Whether they would succeed remained uncertain, but for the first time since his return, hope flickered across a kingdom desperate for stability and leadership. Even after reclaiming his throne, Æthelred the Unready struggled to escape the patterns that had defined his earlier reign. The pressures of leadership, coupled with lingering fears of betrayal and Danish attacks, soon triggered the return of old habits, hesitation, indecision, and over-reliance on advisors whose counsel was often self-serving. The king's promise of reform faced its first real test, and history threatened to repeat itself. Reports of Danish raiders along the coast rekindled Æthelred's long-standing anxiety. Rather than acting decisively, he once again convened prolonged councils, debating endlessly over strategy while the enemy moved freely. Local militias, already wary of past failures, hesitated without clear orders. Villagers and towns, expecting protection from their king, found themselves vulnerable as leadership faltered. Æthelred's tendency to delay critical decisions had returned, weakening both morale and trust. Danegeld, which he had promised to reserve for emergencies, resurfaced as a tempting solution. Faced with new raids, Æthelred authorized payments to the Danes, believing that silver could buy temporary peace. This decision, echoing earlier errors, undermined confidence in his authority. Nobles whispered about the king's indecision, and commoners, remembering past betrayals and defeats, grew skeptical once more. Even within his court, old patterns reappeared. Advisors jostled for influence, offering conflicting strategies and amplifying the king's uncertainty. Æthelred, prone to fear and caution, often deferred to the loudest voices rather than the wisest. Coordination faltered, defenses remained inconsistent, and the kingdom's recovery slowed. The resurfacing of old habits reminded all of England that a crown alone could not ensure effective rule. Æthelred's struggles illustrated the fragile nature of authority, built on promises rather than consistent action. The king's past failures were not easily forgotten, and the re-emergence of these patterns threatened to undo the fragile stability he had just begun to restore. England's future remained uncertain, balanced precariously between hope and repetition of old mistakes. While Æthelred struggled to restore stability in England, a new threat quietly gathered strength across the North Sea. Cnut, son of Sweyn Forkbeard. Unlike his father, Cnut combined ambition with strategic patience, observing the weaknesses of England and the failures of Æthelred before making his move. The Danish prince was young but calculating, aware that a kingdom divided and exhausted by raids was ripe for conquest. Cnut's rise began with careful consolidation of support among the Danish warriors who had survived Sweyn's campaigns. He cultivated loyalty through promises of wealth and status, ensuring that his followers were disciplined and motivated. Meanwhile, he studied England's fractured political landscape. Æthelred's authority remained shaky, earls were divided, and local militias were unreliable. The prince understood that outright force alone would not guarantee success. Timing, alliances, and psychological pressure were equally important. By 1015, Cnut was ready to assert his claim. Crossing the North Sea with a formidable fleet, he positioned himself as a legitimate successor to his father's conquest. His approach was markedly different from earlier raids. Rather than striking isolated towns for treasure, Cnut aimed to seize the throne, projecting both military power and political legitimacy. His forces moved methodically, securing ports, forging alliances with disaffected English nobles, and demonstrating that resistance would be costly. England, though briefly stabilized under Æthelred, was unprepared for this new wave of invasion. The king's reliance on old habits, delays, indecision, and partial reliance on Danegeld left the kingdom vulnerable to a leader who combined ruthlessness with strategy. Cnut's rise marked a turning point. He was no longer a raider seeking tribute, but a conqueror intent on ruling England. By the time Cnut's army advanced inland, it was clear that Æthelred faced a threat far greater than any before. The Danish prince's methodical, calculated rise would soon test every weakness of the English crown, heralding a new chapter in the struggle for control of the kingdom.
In 1015, Cnut the Great launched his renewed invasion of England, marking the beginning of a campaign that would eclipse the previous Danish raids in scale and ambition. Unlike Sweyn's earlier strikes, which relied on swift attacks and tribute extraction, Cnut's forces aimed for total conquest, combining military precision with political strategy. England, already weakened by years of indecision under Æthelred, was ill-prepared to resist a well-organized army led by a determined and charismatic leader. Cnut's fleet, composed of hundreds of longships and seasoned warriors, swept along the east coast, landing troops at strategic points. His commanders moved with coordination, seizing towns, securing supply lines, and establishing fortified bases from which to launch further attacks. Villages that had once survived small raids were now systematically targeted, plundered, and occupied. Resistance, when it appeared, was met with overwhelming force. Local militias, untrained and poorly led, often disbanded at the first sign of confrontation, leaving towns defenseless and amplifying the psychological impact of the invasion. Æthelred, attempting to rally his kingdom, faced the familiar pattern of hesitation and fractured loyalty. Nobles debated over strategy, militias were inconsistently raised, and orders from the king were delayed or ignored. The old methods, Danegeld payments, temporary truces, and reactive defense, proved ineffective against an enemy who combined patience, planning, and ruthless execution. The renewed invasion highlighted the stark contrast between leadership styles. Cnut acted decisively, exploiting divisions and consolidating power,
while Æthelred struggled to unify a kingdom exhausted by years of uncertainty. Each town captured, each river crossing secured by the Danes, further eroded confidence in the English crown. By the end of 1015, it was evident that this invasion was not a mere raid, it was a full-scale campaign of conquest, and England teetered on the brink of permanent Danish domination. By 1016, England's situation had reached a critical point. Ethelred the Unready, though returned to the throne, faced a kingdom exhausted by years of raids, mismanagement, and internal strife. Meanwhile, Cnut the Great advanced relentlessly, his forces well-trained, disciplined, and motivated. England's defenses were stretched to the breaking point, and what remained of the native military was disorganized and demoralized. Yet even in the face of overwhelming odds, pockets of resistance emerged, determined to defend the kingdom and its sovereignty. The last resistance was led by a combination of loyal earls, local militias, and remnants of the royal army. Regions such as Wessex, where loyalty to the English crown remained strong, became the focal point for organized defense. Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, began to take a leading role, rallying forces and attempting to coordinate defensive strategies. Villages were fortified, rivers and marshes used to slow the Danish advance, and guerrilla-style attacks harassed supply lines, aiming to disrupt Cnut's momentum. Despite bravery and localized successes, England's last resistance faced severe limitations. Communication between earls was slow, militias were poorly equipped, and the king's indecision lingered in the background. Each victory was temporary, as Cnut's superior strategy, disciplined army, and ability to exploit divisions gradually overcame pockets of opposition. Towns that initially resisted were eventually forced to surrender, often after harsh sieges. The struggle of England's last resistance highlighted both the courage of its defenders and the weaknesses of its leadership. Ethelred's inability to unify the kingdom had left it vulnerable, while Cnut's determination and tactical skill steadily eroded the remaining English strongholds. By the end of 1016, it became clear that resistance could only delay the inevitable, the fall of England to Danish rule, and the beginning of a new era under Cnut the Great.
By late 1016, Ethelred the Unready faced not only the relentless Danish advance led by Cnut the Great, but also the cruel inevitability of his own failing health. Years of stress, fear, and the burden of repeated failures had taken a severe toll on the aging king. The constant pressure of defending a fractured kingdom, combined with the psychological strain of exile and restoration, left him weakened, both physically and mentally. Ethelred's ailments became increasingly apparent to those around him. He struggled to attend councils for long hours, his energy sapped by chronic illness. Decisions that once required his attention were delayed, left to advisors whose judgment was often flawed or self-serving. His presence on the battlefield became impossible, forcing his son, Edmund Ironside, and loyal earls to take the lead in military engagements. The king's frailty signaled to both allies and enemies that the English throne was vulnerable not only politically, but physically. The timing of his decline could not have been worse. Cnut's forces were pressing into central and southern England with increasing pressure, and the remaining English strongholds required firm leadership to maintain cohesion. Ethelred's failing health meant he could no longer project authority or inspire confidence, leaving nobles uncertain and militias demoralized. Even trusted advisors feared that the king's incapacity would spell disaster for the kingdom. Despite his illness, Ethelred remained concerned for England's survival. He spent his final months offering counsel, guiding strategies,
and attempting to secure his son's succession. Yet the reality was stark. The combination of age, exhaustion, and illness had eroded the king's ability to rule effectively. Ethelred's failing health marked the final weakening of his reign, leaving England vulnerable to conquest and signaling the approaching end of a troubled kingship.
In April 1016, Æthelred the Unready, King of England, breathed his last. After decades of turmoil, marked by Danish raids, political betrayal, failed strategies, and years spent in exile, his death marked the end of a reign defined by struggle, hesitation, and the unrelenting pressures of leadership. Æthelred passed quietly, surrounded by the remnants of a court that had long been strained by mistrust and fear, leaving a kingdom on the brink of transformation. The king's death was both a relief and a crisis for England. Relief, because Æthelred's faltering leadership had repeatedly failed to protect the realm, leaving nobles, clergy, and commoners disillusioned. Crisis, because his passing opened a power vacuum at a moment when the Danish threat, led by Cnut, was stronger than ever. England's defenses were stretched thin, and the succession now fell to Edmund Ironside, Æthelred's eldest surviving son, who faced the enormous challenge of rallying a kingdom exhausted by years of mismanagement and repeated invasions. Æthelred's reign, often criticized for indecision and reliance on temporary solutions like Danegeld, ended with him unable to witness whether his kingdom would survive the onslaught or fall entirely under Danish rule. His failures, hesitation in the face of raids, reliance on gold over military strategy, and the alienation of nobles had weakened the monarchy and left England vulnerable to conquest. Yet his death also marked a turning point. With Æthelred gone, Edmund Ironside could attempt a new approach to unify the nobles, strengthen defenses, and confront Cnut with determination. The death of Æthelred the Unready closed a chapter of weakness, fear, and reactive leadership, setting the stage for England's final struggle against Danish domination, a struggle that would determine the fate of the English crown and the future of the kingdom itself. Following the death of Æthelred the Unready in April 1016, the crown of England passed to his eldest surviving son, Edmund Ironside. Unlike his father, Edmund was young, determined, and seasoned by years of observing his father's failures and enduring Danish threats. From the moment he assumed the throne, he understood the monumental task before him, rallying a fractured kingdom, confronting Cnut's advancing army, and restoring the confidence of nobles and commoners alike. Edmund's ascension was immediately met with both hope and uncertainty. Loyal earls in Wessex and Mercia pledged allegiance, recalling his skill and courage in previous skirmishes against the Danes. Yet other regions, exhausted from years of raids and mismanagement, hesitated to fully commit. The young king had to prove quickly that he was capable of decisive leadership, capable of defending the kingdom where his father had faltered. From the outset, Edmund demonstrated a starkly different approach than Æthelred. He moved swiftly to coordinate military defenses, raising levies and fortifying strategic towns along the coast and river crossings. He personally led troops in battles against Cnut's forces, showing courage that earned him the nickname Ironside and inspiring confidence among soldiers and civilians alike. Unlike his father, he balanced diplomacy with decisive action, securing the loyalty of wavering nobles while confronting traitors with firmness. However, Edmund's reign began under immense pressure. Cnut's Danish forces were experienced, disciplined, and advancing steadily. England's infrastructure had been weakened by years of raids, and morale among the populace was fragile. Every decision, every battle carried enormous weight. Taking the throne,
Edmund Ironside inherited not only the crown, but the legacy of his father's failures. His challenge was clear: to defend England with courage, unite a divided nobility, and confront the unstoppable force of Danish ambition, or risk the complete collapse of the kingdom his father had struggled to protect. By 1016, the contrast between Æthelred the Unready and his son Edmund Ironside was stark and revealing. Æthelred, remembered for hesitation and reliance on tribute payments, had struggled to unite England or effectively repel Danish invaders. Decisions were often delayed, councils were indecisive, and fear drove many of his actions. In contrast, Edmund emerged as a leader defined by decisiveness, courage, and direct action, qualities that seemed to counter the failures of his father. Æthelred's reign was marked by attempts to buy peace through Danegeld, reacting to threats rather than preempting them. He often relied on flawed advisors, trusted little, and allowed paranoia to dictate his policies. The result was a kingdom weakened by both external attack and internal mistrust. England's earls and local militias operated inconsistently, and morale among the populace was low. Even when opportunities to strike against the Danes arose, Æthelred's indecision prevented coordinated action. Edmund, however, quickly demonstrated the opposite approach. From the moment he took the throne, he prioritized action over hesitation, personally leading armies into battle and rallying nobles to defend the kingdom. He combined military strategy with diplomacy, securing alliances while confronting disloyal leaders firmly. Edmund understood that leadership required both presence and decisiveness, contrasting sharply with his father's reactive style. The father-son comparison highlighted lessons in leadership. Æthelred's failures emphasized the dangers of indecision and over-reliance on temporary solutions, while Edmund's approach illustrated the power of courage, strategy, and personal engagement. Yet Edmund also inherited the consequences of his father's mistakes: a fractured kingdom, depleted resources, and a population weary from decades of raids. The shadow of Æthelred's reign loomed over Edmund's early days, providing both a cautionary tale and a challenge: to restore England's strength where his father had faltered, and to confront Cnut with the decisiveness that Æthelred had never shown. By mid-1016, England faced its final struggle against Danish conquest. Edmund Ironside, now king, had rallied what remained of the English forces, yet Cnut the Great's army was vast, disciplined, and relentless. The kingdom, weakened by years of Æthelred's indecision, repeated raids, and internal divisions, teetered on the edge of collapse. Every decision, every battle could determine whether England remained independent or fell entirely under Danish control. Edmund and his commanders organized the defense with urgency. Key strategic positions along rivers and coastal towns were fortified, while levees were raised to intercept Cnut's advancing army. Edmund personally led troops into battle, earning his moniker Ironside through both courage and resilience. Despite his smaller forces, he used clever tactics, ambushes, and the terrain to slow Cnut's advance. Villages that had long feared raids now became temporary bastions of resistance, rallying behind the king's determined leadership. The battles were fierce and costly. Casualties mounted on both sides, and England's infrastructure, already weakened by prior invasions, suffered further devastation. Yet Edmund's determination inspired hope. Nobles who had hesitated pledged loyalty, and local militias fought with renewed vigor. Unlike his father Æthelred, Edmund combined strategy with bold action, refusing to yield without contest. However, Cnut's army remained formidable. His forces, seasoned from years of raids and conquest, adapted quickly to Edmund's tactics, exploiting weaknesses and cutting off supply lines. Despite Edmund's courage, the sheer scale and discipline of the Danish army made victory increasingly uncertain. The final struggle was not merely a battle for territory. It was a test of leadership, loyalty, and national survival. Edmund's courage and tactical skill delayed the inevitable, but the outcome of England's resistance hung in the balance, setting the stage for a fateful conclusion that would determine the kingdom's future under the shadow of Danish ambition. By late 1016, the relentless pressure of Cnut the Great's invasion brought England to the brink. Despite Edmund Ironside's courage and strategic skill, years of weak leadership under Æthelred, combined with divided nobles and exhausted militias, had left the kingdom vulnerable. England, once rich and proud, now faced the harsh reality of foreign domination. Cnut's forces moved systematically, capturing towns, fortresses, and key river crossings. His army, disciplined and motivated, exploited every weakness. Resistance was fierce but fragmented. Edmund and his loyal earls fought bravely, but the English forces were outnumbered and stretched thin. Villages and cities that had resisted raids for decades were finally overwhelmed. The psychological impact of repeated defeats and the knowledge of the king's own limited capacity to protect them eroded the resolve of local leaders. Negotiations between Edmund Ironside and Cnut marked the turning point. Both leaders recognized that prolonged conflict would devastate the kingdom further. A compromise was reached. England was effectively divided, with Cnut controlling the majority of the territory, while Edmund retained Wessex temporarily. This arrangement, however, was tenuous, as Cnut's power and resources far outmatched Edmund's. Within months, Edmund's sudden death, whether from illness or exhaustion, left no obstacle to Cnut's unchallenged rule. Cnut was crowned King of England, completing the conquest that Sweyn Forkbeard had begun and that Ethelred had failed to prevent. English resistance, though valiant, could not withstand a combination of internal division and external pressure. The kingdom now entered a new era under Danish authority, with a foreign king who would impose order, reorganize leadership, and reshape the political landscape. The fall of England to Danish rule illustrated the consequences of weak leadership, fractured loyalty, and indecision. Ethelred's failures, compounded by relentless foreign ambition, had paved the way for conquest. England's sovereignty was lost, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another under Cnut the Great.
By 1016, the end of Anglo-Saxon control over England became undeniable. The death of Edmund Ironside removed the last significant obstacle to Danish dominance, leaving Cnut the Great as the uncontested ruler. The kingdom, once unified under the Wessex dynasty, was now firmly in the hands of a foreign king, marking the conclusion of centuries of Anglo-Saxon rule. Æthelred's failures, combined with decades of raids, indecision, and fragmented leadership, had weakened the monarchy and left the country vulnerable to conquest. The political landscape shifted dramatically. Earls who had once been loyal to Æthelred and Edmund now swore allegiance to Cnut, often reluctantly but pragmatically, recognizing the futility of resistance. English nobles retained their titles and lands only by acknowledging the new order, while previously autonomous regions were brought into a more centralized structure under Danish oversight. The traditional Anglo-Saxon institutions, local councils, royal courts, and military levies were adapted to serve Cnut's rule, ensuring stability while gradually eroding the cultural and political identity of the native rulers. For the common people, the change was profound but mixed. Danish governance brought relative stability after years of chaos, raids, and tribute demands under Æthelred. Yet it also symbolized the loss of their native monarchy. The Wessex line,
which had guided England through generations, was displaced, leaving a sense of mourning and nostalgia for a past era of native sovereignty. The end of Anglo-Saxon control underscored the consequences of weak leadership and divided loyalties. Æthelred's reign, characterized by indecision, fear-driven policies, and reactive measures, had left the kingdom unable to resist determined, organized conquest. With Cnut firmly on the throne, England entered a new chapter, one of Danish rule, political restructuring, and the permanent transformation of the Anglo-Saxon legacy. The age of Wessex kings had ended, closing a pivotal chapter in English history.
Throughout Ethelred the Unready's reign, one recurring tragedy was his leadership without true authority. Though crowned King of England, Ethelred often lacked the ability to enforce decisions, inspire loyalty, or unify his nobles. His title carried weight, but the power behind it, obedience, respect, and effective governance, was frequently absent. This disconnection between position and authority defined much of his reign and contributed directly to England's vulnerability to Danish conquest. Ethelred inherited the throne as a young king, but his early missteps, marked by indecision, reliance on Danegeld, and harsh measures such as the St. Brice's Day massacre, eroded confidence among the nobility. Earls and local leaders often acted independently, ignoring royal orders or negotiating with invaders on their own terms. Militias were raised inconsistently, defenses fell apart, and villagers had little trust that the king would protect them. Ethelred's crown gave him a symbolic claim, yet his authority was often challenged at every level. Even when he attempted decisive action, his fear and indecision undermined his own commands. Councils became forums for debate rather than strategy, advisors vied for influence, and orders were delayed or contradictory. England's people saw a king unable to project power effectively, fostering resentment, doubt, and occasional rebellion. Authority, without which leadership is hollow, was a constant challenge for Ethelred, limiting his ability to unify the kingdom or respond to the Danish threat. This gap between leadership and authority offers a vital lesson. A title alone cannot secure loyalty, enforce law, or defend a nation. Ethelred's reign demonstrates that without the ability to command respect and coordinate effectively, even a king with resources and ambition becomes vulnerable. Leadership without authority, as in Ethelred's case, can leave a kingdom exposed, divided, and ultimately at the mercy of its enemies. Æthelred the Unready's reign was defined not only by indecision and fear, but by the influence of bad counsel, a factor that profoundly shaped England's decline. From his earliest years on the throne, the king relied heavily on advisors whose guidance was often self-serving, short-sighted, or poorly informed. Their counsel magnified his weaknesses, leading to decisions that undermined the monarchy and left the kingdom vulnerable to both internal dissent and foreign invasion. One of the most infamous examples was the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002. Advised by courtiers who encouraged drastic action against Danish settlers, Æthelred ordered the slaughter of men, women, and children of Danish descent. This decision, rooted in fear and bad counsel, provoked Sweyn Forkbeard's wrath and ultimately triggered years of relentless Danish attacks. Similarly, Æthelred's repeated reliance on Danegeld, payments meant to buy temporary peace, was often encouraged by advisors who prioritized immediate safety over long-term strategy. These payments drained the treasury, failed to deter invaders, and eroded public confidence in the king's leadership.
bad counsel also exacerbated divisions among the nobility. Advisors frequently stoked rivalries, encouraged suspicion, and promoted factionalism, preventing the king from uniting his earls into a coordinated defense. When the Danish threat intensified, Æthelred's decisions were paralyzed by conflicting advice, delaying action and costing precious time. Battles were lost, towns fell, and England's defenses crumbled, all amplified by the misdirection of those he trusted most. The cost of bad counsel extended beyond immediate defeats. It shaped the perception of Æthelred as a weak, indecisive ruler whose reign was defined by fear and reaction rather than strategy. England's vulnerability to Cnut's eventual conquest was in no small part the product of advisors who failed to guide the king wisely. The story of Æthelred demonstrates that even a king with power can be undone by those entrusted to advise him, leaving a kingdom exposed to ruin. Æthelred the Unready's reign was plagued by a pattern that would earn him his infamous epithet: reliance on money over military might. Instead of strengthening England's armies or fortifying defenses, the king frequently turned to Danegeld, paying off Viking raiders to secure temporary peace. While this approach may have seemed pragmatic in the short term, it revealed deeper weaknesses in Æthelred's leadership and left the kingdom vulnerable to repeated invasions. Danegeld drained the royal treasury, forcing heavy taxation on nobles and commoners alike. Wealth was transferred to invaders, often without tangible security in return. Villages, towns, and cities that paid tribute were frequently attacked again as Vikings learned that England was rich but hesitant to fight. Æthelred's strategy prioritized silver over preparation, sending a clear message: the crown lacked the resolve or capacity to defend the realm by force. This reliance on payments also undermined morale. English nobles questioned the king's authority and commitment, while local militias were left underfunded, undertrained, and ill-equipped. Townsfolk, watching treasure flow to foreign raiders instead of seeing fortifications strengthened or armies mobilized, grew increasingly distrustful of the monarchy. The policy of buying peace weakened the social contract between ruler and subjects, eroding loyalty and unity at a time when cohesive defense was essential. Moreover, Danegeld emboldened the Danes. Every payment reinforced the perception that England could be extorted, incentivizing further raids rather than deterring them. Sweyn, Forkbeard, and later Cnut saw opportunity in Æthelred's dependence on gold, exploiting it to press their claims and eventually conquer the kingdom. In the end, money over might exemplified the failures of Æthelred's reign. A kingdom rich in resources was repeatedly humbled because its king chose tribute over action, temporary respite over strategic strength. The policy highlighted not clever diplomacy, but weakness, setting the stage for England's eventual subjugation under Danish rule. Throughout his reign, Æthelred the Unready ruled largely through fear, a tactic that ultimately undermined both his authority and England's ability to resist the Danes. From threats against disloyal nobles to brutal massacres of perceived enemies, Æthelred's policies often prioritized intimidation over strategy or diplomacy. While fear may have temporarily silenced dissent, it created resentment, mistrust, and a fractured kingdom vulnerable to external threats. The St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002 is perhaps the most infamous example of fear as policy. Æthelred, influenced by advisors and driven by paranoia, ordered the killing of Danes in England, including women and children. Intended to neutralize a perceived internal threat, the massacre backfired. It provoked Sweyn Forkbeard, who used the atrocity as justification for a prolonged campaign of invasion. What was meant to secure England instead invited greater violence and destruction, illustrating the danger of ruling through fear rather than foresight. Fear also weakened the loyalty of Æthelred's nobles. Harsh punishments, suspicion of betrayal, and punitive taxation left earls and local leaders hesitant to commit fully to the crown. Militias were underfunded, and towns often resisted the king's orders, unsure whether obedience would protect them or provoke his wrath. England's social cohesion, vital for defense against invaders, eroded under a regime where fear replaced trust. Even when external threats loomed, Æthelred's reliance on intimidation rather than decisive leadership caused hesitation and mismanagement. Battles were lost, towns fell, and the king's subjects often looked to their own survival rather than unified resistance. In the end, fear as policy exemplified the failures of Æthelred's reign. While it might have temporarily suppressed opposition, it destabilized the kingdom, undermined loyalty, and weakened England's defenses, leaving the door open for Danish conquest and cementing Æthelred's reputation as a ruler whose crown was more symbolic than powerful.
Ethelred the Unready's reign was marked not only by fear and indecision, but also by missed opportunities, moments where decisive action could have altered England's fate but were ignored or mishandled. Throughout his rule, the king faced threats that required swift, strategic responses. Instead, he often hesitated, misjudged situations, or relied on temporary fixes, allowing enemies to exploit the kingdom's vulnerabilities. One such missed chance was the opportunity to unite the English nobility against the Danish threat early in his reign. Æthelred's distrust of his earls, combined with reliance on advisors who encouraged suspicion, prevented him from creating a cohesive defense. While Sweyn Forkbeard and later Cnut capitalized on divisions among the English elite, Æthelred failed to rally loyalty or organize coordinated resistance. England remained fractured, and localized forces often acted independently or not at all while the Danes advanced. Another critical missed chance was in fortifying England's military infrastructure. Years of raids revealed weaknesses in coastal defenses, militia organization, and rapid response capabilities. Æthelred's focus on Danegeld payments over proactive measures left towns exposed, rivers undefended, and key fortresses vulnerable. Each delay or misallocation of resources allowed the Danes to strike repeatedly, reinforcing the perception that England could be extorted and attacked with impunity. Even diplomacy offered opportunities that Æthelred failed to seize. Alliances with neighboring kingdoms, strategic marriages, or negotiations with disaffected nobles might have strengthened his position. Instead, indecision and over-reliance on temporary solutions created a pattern. Each potential advantage slipped away, leaving the kingdom weaker than before. These missed chances compounded over time, turning manageable threats into catastrophic defeats. Æthelred's inability to act decisively, to plan ahead, and to unite his kingdom ensured that England's fate was increasingly dictated by foreign hands rather than its own rulers. His reign serves as a stark lesson in how hesitation and missed opportunities can shape the history.
Ethelred the Unready's legacy is often defined by his epithet, implying a king ill-prepared, indecisive, or incompetent. Yet a closer examination suggests that the term unready may be misleading. In Old English, the word unrad literally means poor counsel or ill-advised, indicating that Ethelred's failures were less about personal incapacity and more about the quality of advice and guidance he received throughout his reign. From the beginning, Ethelred inherited a kingdom under threat. Viking raids had grown more frequent and organized, political factions within England were fractured, and the monarchy itself was still consolidating authority after decades of transition. The king faced immense challenges that demanded rapid decisions with limited resources. While some decisions, such as the St. Brice's Day massacre or repeated reliance on Danegeld, proved disastrous, they were often the result of poor counsel and reactive strategies rather than inherent incompetence. Furthermore, Ethelred's attempts at defense and governance reveal a ruler who understood the stakes. He reorganized defenses, issued charters to reinforce royal authority, and attempted to mobilize militias and fortifications against Danish threats. His retreats and exiles, often criticized as cowardice, were pragmatic attempts to preserve the monarchy and maintain a claim to the throne when immediate victory was impossible. The real issue was the structural weakness of England at the time. Nobles were independent-minded, communication was slow, and military coordination was difficult. Decisions made in councils were often undermined by competing interests and slow implementation. Ethelred's repeated failures, then, reflect systemic challenges, fear-driven culture, and poor advice, rather than a fundamentally unready king. In retrospect, the epithet oversimplifies a complex reign. Ethelred's story is not solely of one of incompetence. It is a tale of a ruler constrained by circumstance, dependent on flawed advisors, and struggling to navigate a kingdom beset by internal divisions and relentless external threats. His unreadiness was as much about context and counsel as it was about personal capacity. Ethelred the Unready is often remembered as a weak and indecisive king, but in many ways he was a victim of his time. England at the turn of the 11th century faced unprecedented challenges, relentless Danish raids, a fractured nobility, and a monarchy still struggling to consolidate authority after generations of internal turmoil. Ethelred inherited a kingdom under siege, one in which even decisive action could fail if timing, resources, and loyalty did not align. The external pressures alone were formidable. Viking raids had evolved from opportunistic attacks into organized campaigns led by leaders like Sweyn Forkbeard. These invasions tested the limits of any ruler's ability to respond. England's defenses were decentralized, militias were unevenly trained, and communication across the kingdom was slow. Even a skilled king would have struggled to maintain control over such a fragmented system in the face of a relentless, mobile enemy. Internally, Ethelred faced a divided nobility. Earls often acted independently, pursuing their own interests, negotiating with invaders, or withholding support. Councils were dominated by competing factions, and advisors frequently provided conflicting guidance, some motivated by self-interest rather than the welfare of the kingdom. This environment made decisive, coordinated leadership nearly impossible. Ethelred's reliance on Danegeld and other reactive measures, often criticized as weakness, can be seen instead as pragmatic attempts to preserve the kingdom in impossible circumstances. While his strategies failed, they reflected a ruler responding to crises with limited tools and information. Viewed in context, Ethelred emerges less as an inherently incompetent king and more as a monarch overwhelmed by the political, social, and military realities of his era. His failures were not solely personal. They were the product of a kingdom under pressure from external invasion and internal fragmentation, a ruler shaped and constrained by the turbulent times in which he lived.
The reign of Æthelred the Unready offers enduring lessons for kings and nations, illustrating how leadership, decision-making, and counsel can determine a kingdom's survival or downfall. Æthelred's failures were not simply personal flaws. They reflected structural weaknesses,
poor advice, and a leadership style that prioritized fear and short-term solutions over strategic foresight. For rulers and nations alike, his story serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of indecision and mismanagement. One key lesson is the importance of effective counsel. Æthelred relied heavily on advisors whose guidance was often self-serving or short-sighted. Decisions like the St. Brice's Day massacre and repeated payments of Danegeld were amplified by bad advice, demonstrating that even a king with authority can be undermined by those he trusts. Leaders must carefully choose advisors whose loyalty and wisdom serve the long-term interests of the state rather than temporary expedients. Another lesson lies in the balance between diplomacy and force. Æthelred's dependence on Danegeld to buy peace exemplifies the danger of prioritizing short-term appeasement over preparation and defense. Nations facing external threats cannot rely solely on concessions. They must invest in infrastructure, military readiness, and the unity of their people to withstand pressure from determined adversaries. Finally, Æthelred's reign underscores the consequences of divided leadership and internal disunity. Fragmented nobles, poorly coordinated militias, and competing factions made England vulnerable to external conquest. For a nation to survive crises, cohesion, loyalty, and clear lines of authority are essential. The story of Æthelred the Unready reminds kings and nations that power is more than a crown or title. It is the ability to act decisively, choose wise counsel, unify subjects, and balance courage with strategy. When these elements fail, even a wealthy and resource-rich kingdom can fall, leaving lessons for future generations to heed. After Cnut the Great secured the English throne, a new chapter began in England's history: the Danes who stayed. Unlike earlier raiders who came, plundered, and left, Cnut's conquest brought permanent settlement, political integration, and cultural influence. Danish warriors, administrators, and their families became part of the English landscape, transforming society in ways that would endure long after Æthelred the Unready's reign had ended. These Danes were not merely conquerors. They became landholders, advisors, and officials within Cnut's administration. Formerly independent earls were brought under central control, while Danish nobles were granted estates as rewards for loyalty. Towns once devastated by raids were rebuilt, often with Danish oversight, creating centers of administration, trade, and military organization. This integration was strategic. By embedding Danish authority into English governance, Cnut ensured stability while reducing the risk of rebellion. Culturally, the presence of Danes reshaped England. Scandinavian customs, laws, and traditions influenced local communities, particularly in areas of heavy settlement like East Anglia, York, and the Eastern Shires. Place names, legal practices, and even language bore the imprint of Danish settlers. Intermarriage between Danes and English families further intertwined the populations, blending cultures and forging a new social fabric. Yet this integration was not without tension. Some English nobles and commoners resented foreign rule, wary of taxation, land redistribution, and the lingering memory of raids. Cnut's careful diplomacy and strong leadership mitigated open revolt, but subtle resistance persisted in pockets of the kingdom. The Danes who stayed were a living reminder of the consequences of Æthelred's failures. A kingdom weakened by indecision, divided loyalty, and reactive leadership became a new homeland for foreign rulers. Their permanent settlement transformed England, marking the transition from a kingdom struggling to defend itself to one governed under Danish authority, a lasting legacy of conquest and cultural fusion.
Æthelred the Unready's reign stands as one of the most cautionary tales in English history, a king who inherited a kingdom rich in potential but plagued by challenges, yet repeatedly failed to act decisively. His epithet, unready, reflects not merely personal hesitation, but the broader consequences of leadership hampered by poor counsel, fear, and reactive policies. From early Viking raids to repeated payments of Danegeld, and from the St. Brice's Day massacre to his exile, Æthelred's reign illustrates the fragility of authority when decisiveness is absent. Despite moments of effort to reform defenses or rally the nobility, Æthelred's indecision left England fragmented and vulnerable. The rise of Cnut the Great and the eventual Danish conquest were, in many ways, the predictable outcome of years of missed opportunities, divided loyalties, and over-reliance on temporary fixes. Even his son, Edmund Ironside, inherited a kingdom already weakened by decades of mismanagement and fear-driven policies. Æthelred's story demonstrates that a crown alone does not guarantee power. Leadership requires courage, clarity, and the ability to inspire unity. Reflecting on Æthelred's reign, we see a ruler shaped as much by circumstance as by personal flaws. His failures offer lessons in governance, strategy, and the vital importance of good counsel. England's fate reminds us that indecision, especially in moments of crisis, can alter history and open the door to conquest and cultural transformation. If you found this exploration of Æthelred the Unready insightful, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on whether Æthelred was truly unready or simply a king trapped by his times. Your engagement helps bring history to life and keeps the discussion going.